Then you're only just begun.
Yeah, well, I did. I didn't spread it
All right. Since Justin was preaching on Acts 2, I thought it'd be a good place to go over. I'm going to talk a little bit about eschatology, because it's a big point with the Jehovah's Witnesses. They like to talk about eschatology quite a bit. So I'm going to go over a little bit on that and just proper hermeneutics, and just understanding how to properly understand and interpret the Bible. So a big point in proper hermeneutics is context. Anytime you take a class or anything to learn about hermeneutics, it's all about context. And it's a huge point to remember. You have to keep all of Scripture within context about what it's talking
Nick, what is
about.
hermeneutics?
Hermeneutics is the study of the interpretation of the Bible. And when you're studying that, context is a big point, big key. There's a lot of people who, and even in evangelical circles, they like to pull verses out of context and put it in a different context. And you have that problem all the time, and you have that as a big problem within the Jehovah's Witnesses. They do that quite a bit within their eschatology. So I'm going to use kind of Acts 2 as just kind of an example, because Justin had went over that, and he had brought up some good points in his sermon, and so I just want to kind of bring that up again, just as an example. And then after that, we're going to go to Matthew chapter 24, and we're going to go over certain things that Jehovah's Witnesses use out of Matthew 24, and they pull a lot of stuff out of context there for their eschatology. So in Acts chapter 2, and I'll be starting in verse 14. So, as we know in Acts chapter 2, they have all the Jews gathered there, and they're all speaking each other's language. They can understand each other. They're asking what's going on, how is this happening, and then others are mocking and saying that they're drunk, drinking. So at this point, Peter stands up to explain what's happening. And it says, "But Peter, standing with the 11, lifted up his voice and addressed them. 'Men of Judea and all who dwell in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and give ear to my words. For these people are not drunk, as you suppose, since it's only the third hour of the day. But this is what was uttered through the prophet Joel.'" So then he goes on to quote the prophet Joel. What's up? Morning.
Morning, Jerry.
Thanks, Pete.
I'm glad to see
Sneak
you.
in without anybody seeing me.
So Peter is going to quote the prophet Joel, and basically what he's doing is he says, this is what the prophet Joel was talking about. What's happening right now is what the prophet Joel was speaking about. So basically he's saying prophecy is being fulfilled right now. And I want you to notice the very first line. It says, "And in the last days it shall be God declares that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy." So he says, "and in the last days." So the last days does not necessarily mean the end of the world. The last days in this context means the end of the old covenant and the start of the new covenant, the beginning of the church. This was the beginning of the church. So anytime we see something that says the last days, or the end of the age or something like that, it does not mean the end of the world. We have to keep it in context as to what it's talking about. So in this one, it's talking about, "And in the last days shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even on my male servants and female servants in those days I will pour out my spirit, and they shall prophesy." So in the next few verses after that, he's talking about judgment, the judgment that's still to come. It says, "And I will show wonders in the heaven above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood, before the day of the Lord comes, the great and magnificent day. And it shall come to pass that everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved." So basically what he's showing is that this prophecy is being fulfilled then. It was being fulfilled back then. And that the coming judgment was soon. And if you know your Christian history, it was 70 AD when this took place, when Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed.
Right.
So this took place back then, and the judgment came very, very quickly. Now, the thing is I've actually had to go over these verses with many Christians before and just walk them through the verse very slowly and show them that the context is showing that these verses, this prophecy is being fulfilled right then and there during the Pentecost. So it wasn't talking about a future time, thousands of years down the road. It was talking about right then and there, because Peter says it was.
Well, even when Jesus, when he was coming in, what we call it on Palm Sunday, when he stopped over Jerusalem,
Right.
he talking about the same thing. I mean, if you guys only knew what was going to happen, that's when they started pulling in the houses on top of families,
Right.
and all of these things. So we have to, and I think this is where Nick is gone sure of it. Is context means so much, and what a blessing that we get to stand here and we're seeing the scripture fulfilled, to this point. So, even in those days, I mean, even Paul is talking about, hey, the last days.
Right.
I believe that we're closer today than we were yesterday.
Right.
Absolutely. If you don't believe that, turn on the news.
Mhm.
But Jesus said, even the Son of Man doesn't know when he's coming back.
Yep.
And so we just got to keep our eyes open and
Mm-hmm.
It's great to have.
what Scripture says.
It's great to have favorite verses. It really is. But you have to understand that around those favorite verses is all the context.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
There's a whole nother book around
you
it.
know, Philippians and Philippians 4, it gets misused so much,
Mhm.
all the time.
Yeah.
Nobody ever reads the next verse, where
Somebody does.
it digs deeper, digs a lot deeper, so.
So yeah, and one of the things I was going to point out too is it says the day of the Lord comes. The day of the Lord, when you look in the Old Testament, anytime it says the day of the Lord comes, it's almost always referring to a judgment on the people. It's a judgment on the people that's coming. The same thing is used for when Jesus says the Son of Man is coming, or the coming of the Son of Man. That's also another day of judgment. Even though he's also talking about himself, because he also calls himself the Son of Man. But when he says the coming of the Son of Man, it's almost always followed by prophecy of some kind of judgment on people. So that's another thing to remember when you see those phrases, is that they're used like that in that context. So the things that I've have discussions with many times with other Christians is the context of verses 17 through 21 here. And because I've had a lot of Christians try to tell me that what's being said here refers to the end days for us. And it doesn't. It's referring to the end days for them as far as the end of the old covenant and the starting of the new covenant.
Well, I mean, Peter's pretty clear right there too, that this
Right.
is, this is being fulfilled.
Right, yeah, he says this is being fulfilled right now.
Okay. So how do you know? Is it because of the translation that people get confused?
No, what happens is people already have an idea of what they think the end times is going to be.
Right.
And so what they like to do is they like to just pull these verses out of context without even reading the whole thing.
Okay.
They like to pull these verses out and then apply it over here and say it's talking about some kind of end times for us, when that's not the case. And the thing is the Jehovah Witnesses, they do that a lot too. And so when you're having a discussion with them, if they're bringing up anything on eschatology or end times, you want to make sure you're checking the context and showing them the context of those verses so that they understand.
Now, can you point out to me where it's saying that this was happening then, in 70 AD?
Peter says that it was happening then, right then and there, that was being fulfilled. Now, if you know what I'm saying about as far as this being fulfilled, is this Christian history in 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed, and the temple was destroyed. Yeah. So that's something you can.
I'm just reading this here, and it it doesn't say
No.
now, it doesn't say at this time,
No.
it just says.
But if you look at what Peter says, he stands up and he says, this is what's happening, and this is what Joel, the prophet Joel, was talking about. So that's the context. He's telling them what the prophet Joel said, this is being fulfilled right now.
Fulfillment is never ending, right? Wouldn't you say? Until,
Well, the end of the days was the end of that time for them.
Yeah.
So that last days was the end of the old covenant, and it was the beginning of the church, which is what was happening there.
It really goes to the Romans 10:4,
Right.
you know, where, it's like the past, Romans 10:4, Christ is the end of the law, that's it. It's
Right.
End of those days,
Yep.
you know.
So yeah, I point that out because like I said, the Jehovah's Witnesses and some other Christians like to pull these verses out of context to say, oh, you know, this is happening now, it's the end days and stuff like that. And you know, I don't argue that we're in some definitely some sketchy stuff going on right now, but what this is talking about specifically was back then. So that's the context there.
because now wasn't pertinent to them.
Because from that point
You know,
forward.
God didn't put anything, he wanted them to grasp what they had, not
Right.
what we got.
Right.
Yeah.
You know what
Come on.
act-
The word.
And Peter being up against the wall against the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they were trying to make the Jewish nation come to the understanding that Jesus was the Christ, is the Christ.
Right.
And this is the turn the page moment then, in what should have been their beliefs. And
Preach it, sister.
that's, that's what it says, they're up against the wall and they're getting killed, they're getting put in jail, everything, and they're getting proved that Jesus Christ is the Christ. And they still are denying him to this day,
Yep. Yep.
so.
So yeah, the next example I'm going to use is Matthew 24. And the reason I'm going to use this is because Jehovah's Witnesses actually, they'll go to this chapter specifically when they're referring to their anointed class of people. If you remember that from a few weeks ago, when we were talking about the different classes of people within Jehovah's Witnesses. And they believe in there's an anointed class, or what they call the Christ class. And they like to pull from these verses to say that that's what it's talking about.
She would have just.
So in chapter 24, I'm going to start with verse 1, and I'm just going to start reading through. So as I read this, I want you to try to put yourself in the place of the disciples at this point.
24 what?
One.
Verse 1, we're going to start at verse 1. So try to imagine that you're with the disciples, and this is first century Jerusalem, and you're walking by the temple, and this is what's happening. Try to remember you're in this spot, and it's really going to help you with the context of what's happening here. So verse 1 says, Jesus left the temple and was going away, when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, you see all these? Do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. So they're walking by the temple. The disciples say, they're pointing out the temple, and Jesus says, do you see all these stones? They're going to be thrown down. There's not going to be one left on another. As he sat on the mountain of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So they're asking about the end of the age. And they're asking, what's the sign going to be? And Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ. And they will lead many astray. And you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. But the end is not yet. The end of what? The end of the age. The end of the age is not yet.
Won't be until it's
For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginnings of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. So he's telling that directly to the disciples. They will be put to death, and they will be put through tribulation. That doesn't mean that there won't be other tribulation for the church. There's always going to be tribulation for the church. But he's specifically referencing or answering their questions. So that context is for them, that they're going to be put to death. And if you know your history, your Christian history, the disciples, almost all of them were martyred. So,
All but
and then John was
Yeah,
boiled
they tried to
with
flash
oil.
Ryan.
yeah, they tried to fly.
So yeah, so when he says that, he's answering their question, and he's telling this to them. So the context is, they're walking by the temple. They point out the temple. Jesus says this is all going to be thrown down, and they ask him, when is this going to be? What's the sign going to be? And when's the end of the age going to be? And so the entire context is focused on those questions. So when Jesus is talking, he's answering those questions. He's not trying to say that, all this is going to happen thousands of years from now. Don't worry about it. He's not saying any of that. He's saying this is going to happen soon, and it's going to happen to you. And one of the things I want to point out as we start to read through this is that Jesus gives them a warning about what's coming. He gives them a really big warning, and then he gives very specific instructions on what to do when this happens. Very specific. So that's why when we see what the instructions that he gives them, we know that this is happening to them. We know that it's happening to them soon in their context. It says, and then many will fall away, in verse 10, and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. The end of what? The end of the age. So then we have, in the next few verses, Jesus is talking about the abomination of desolation. And he references the book of Daniel and talking about the 70 weeks and stuff like that. So all of this in these next few verses is usually where the Jehovah's Witnesses are going to go to try to prove the anointed class or the Christ class of people. Now, if you remember correctly, the anointed class of people are the people that they believe were witnesses to the 1914 prophecy that they said was fulfilled, which was not. They believed that Christ returned in 1914 in spirit, and anybody that was alive during that time is part of the anointed class who was a Jehovah's Witness, and that they were going to live through the end of all of this. Obviously, nobody that was alive in 1914 is really still alive, except for maybe a few people. So most of those people are gone. So that's another one of their prophecies that's not fulfilled, obviously. But they like to use these verses to support that. And if you go through the context, you can tell that Jesus is talking. This is going to happen to them. This is going to happen soon. This judgment is going to happen soon. And he's going to give very specific instructions on what to do. So starting in verse 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. That's a pretty specific instruction.
Yeah.
Those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So he's saying, when you see him standing in the holy place, and you see the destruction, run to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down and take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. So he's saying, if you're seeing this happen and you're out in the field, don't go back. Yeah,
Go now.
Yeah, don't go back to your house. Run to the mountains. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such has not been from the beginning of the world until now, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. Now what he's saying is, he's saying that if they're saying, hey, Jesus is out in the wilderness, come see him. They're like, don't go do that. Why?
Trap.
It's a trap. They're going to be killed if they do that. So, and then he also says, for as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far to the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. So the coming of the Son of Man is a day of judgment. And like I said, if you know your Christian history, in 70 AD, which was not very long after the Pentecost, Jerusalem was destroyed completely by the Roman Empire. And it was Titus, is that correct?
Yep.
Titus that stood in the temple when it was destroyed. He stood in the holy place. So there's your abomination of desolation fulfilled. And if you look online, it says, I think it says 1.1 million Jews were killed in Jerusalem. And the reason there was so many Jews in Jerusalem at that time was because it was the Passover. And they had Jews from every nation in Jerusalem at that time. And the ones who were not killed were the Christians, because they knew what they were supposed to do. They fled to the mountains, and they were saved from that destruction. So that's something you can look up online. It was, what was the Jewish,
Flavius Josephus?
yeah, Flavius Josephus, yeah. His account of that is pretty horrific.
Yeah.
So
What
all
is
of,
that called? Is it Jewish history?
yeah,
Some, I can't think of the exact title, but that's who it is.
Josephus, yeah. So everything that we're reading in Matthew 24 here was fulfilled. It came very quickly, came very soon, right after the Pentecost. What they were talking about as far as the last days or the end of the age, that discussion was all about the end of the old covenant. The end of the old covenant. Those people who were still trying to hold to the old ways and rejecting Christ, those people were judged. Jerusalem was destroyed. Their temple was destroyed. The Christians fled. They were saved because they knew what to look for. So all of this is referencing to something that already happened.
What were they talking about in the second half of verse 26 there? If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. Like, in their own home?
Just anywhere in the inner rooms in Jerusalem.
Inner rooms
Yeah.
and all of that.
Yeah.
Oh, temple.
Well, and a lot of them were starting to say, oh, well, there he is, he's coming back, he's coming back, he's
Right.
coming back. And that's when, and I'm sure he's going to touch on this here in a minute, but that's when, Jesus starts telling them, look, this is, when Jesus comes back, they're going to see it.
You're going to see it.
They're not,
Everybody's going to see it. Everybody's
Yeah.
going to
Yeah,
know.
it ain't gonna be no
Yeah,
secret.
exactly, it's not going to be,
Yeah.
Ain't gonna be in Houston, Texas,
Yeah.
Compact Center.
yeah.
Yeah, it's not going to be a secret. It's not going to be a secret event.
It's gonna be a surprise what it's gonna be.
Yeah, it'll be a surprise, but it ain't going to be a secret.
That's right, that's right.
I don't know you.
Right, and that's the truth.
You said that in 1914?
Yeah, the Jehovah's Witnesses like to use these verses as something for the apocalypse that's towards the future of us.
I gotta do some historic research, but
Okay.
1914 is when they thought that this was gonna happen
They thought that Christ returned, in 1914 invisibly.
invisibly.
Yeah.
Cool, okay,
So wasn't it the ones that
what
were
Bible
alive
are they
then or
reading?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not totally
No-
saying you're.
None of them people were
everybody's gonna
alive,
see it.
Nick.
Well,
Do the
and
math.
just kind of
They're
touching
not.
on that,
Yeah.
beforehand, they had, beforehand, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they said, oh, no, this is gonna happen, it's gonna happen right now.
Yeah,
It didn't happen.
yeah.
Right,
It's
right.
already-
Well, we miscalculated, so it's actually gonna happen
Right.
now.
Right, right.
Didn't happen. Then they go back and say, well, actually, it did happen, but nobody else saw it.
Right.
Oh.
That's a sign right there to run.
Yes.
Now run to the
I
mountain.
mean, that's the lay version of it, but it did happen, but nobody else saw
But
it.
nobody else saw it, yeah.
what I've told those people
Yeah.
standing on my doorstep is you have to judge the people by what they're saying is gonna happen.
Yeah.
Judge a prophet by
Absolutely.
what really happens, it's prophesied. And I pull out the Bible and they never come out.
They're guessing.
Yeah, sometimes.
Yep, so when Christ returns, it's gonna be something everybody will see. So, starting in verse 29, this is about the coming of the Son of Man. And so, the coming of the Son of Man, if you notice, there's gonna be some very similar language here to what we just read in Acts chapter 2, as far as the coming, or the coming of the day of the Lord. So, starting in verse 29, it says, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in the heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." So,
Not gonna
if
be
you notice,
secret.
there's a lot of judgment language there. There's a lot of something, this is gonna happen, and there's blood, fire, the sun's gonna be darkened, all of that stuff. Go ahead, Justin.
Oh, no, I'm just agreeing with you, man. I mean, it's, like I said, it's not gonna be a secret.
Right, it's not a
It's
secret.
not a hidden thing.
Yeah.
He will gather his elect from the four winds,
Mm.
about 144,000.
That's an awesome God.
Yeah,
I don't know
right.
any other God on this planet that's got
Yeah.
a
It's
planet
not the
like that.
144,000.
I'm all over it, brother.
That's it.
So, and then I'm going to read the lesson of the fig tree, which starts in verse 32 here. "From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." So again, we have another confirmation here that he was talking about back then. That this generation will not pass away until all of this takes place. So that's a confirmation on the context, because context has not changed. Jesus is still talking and answering their question. The context is for back then. It's not for today. It's not for, our end times. It's for theirs.
Well, he gave a sign,
Mhm.
the when he's coming back, the foretelling prophecy at this point, the very beginning of the New Testament. You will see me, you will see the sun be dark, the stars are gonna fall, and the moon will not shine,
Yep.
and you will see me coming.
Like a
Everywhere
lightning
in the
bolt.
world, like a lightning bolt.
Like a
You
lightning
know,
bolt. So
but,
in the,
but that's not what that's just a sign of that he's coming,
Mhm.
But that's not
But
talking
that's
about
not,
then.
that's not talking about that, that's talking about in the future, but the rest of this is talking about the end of the time now.
right.
But it's pertinent to now,
Yeah, it's pertinent.
because it's all New Testament, it's a new covenant, it's us, but it was pertinent to them, they couldn't think about 2000 and.
Right,
Right.
and that's the thing, is that when Christ was talking to them, he was answering their question. He wasn't talking about 2,000 years in the future. He was talking about, this is gonna happen to you now. When I come, you're gonna see it, everybody's gonna see it, but this is what's gonna happen to you now. Judgment's gonna happen,
Yep.
Jerusalem's gonna be taken down, temple's gonna be destroyed, and all those
And
things.
here is the end of the old covenant,
And it's all
Right,
history.
and the beginning of the church age.
in the beginning of the,
So yeah, when the Jehovah's Witnesses tried to pull verses out of these chapters to say that this is happening now, or this is happening future, or Armageddon's coming, look at these verses, that's how you can show them, well, you're pulling that out of context. The context is, the disciples asked Jesus a question, he was answering the question, he was telling them that this was for their time. This is the end of the age, end of the old covenant, and the beginning of the new covenant, beginning of the church age.
And what I think is, especially what Nick is saying, is context is everything.
Mhm.
And that's not even Jehovah's Witness. I mean, that's everybody. We need to read the Bible in its context
Right.
of what it's saying. Otherwise, I mean, we're judged on that. We start taking stuff out of context and start applying differently. And that's a misuse of Scripture. And And so, and there, Jehovah's Witnesses aren't the only one. I can give you a list of a lot of evangelical, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're
Times
not-
my own life, I've been
Because
guilty
they're
of it.
not reading the Bible.
That's right.
They're listening to somebody that's kind of leading
Right.
them that way, and then,
Mhm.
and they don't have the discernment to realize. The more you read the Bible, the more God is clear. If you read it with your heart instead of your mind, your physical mind, I think it communicates with you a lot better. It does with me, you know what I mean? Because there's so many different messages you can get, but.
And again, I don't think Nick he's not speaking against like time. Like I said, I think we're closer today than we were yesterday
Right.
by any means. If Jesus
Absolutely,
coming back.
that's the truth right there.
But what this passage that they're taking out is applying to an age that happened.
Right. It's already.
In historical context, even outside of the Bible.
Mhm.
We can go to Flavius Josephus, the Annuals of Jewish history and things like that.
And it's all warnings, right?
Sure.
You know, it's all
Mhm.
warnings, and what's a warning good for? If you don't heed a warning, you know, what are you gonna do? And we're being warned the whole time is to be ready,
Mhm.
receive me, so you can, you know, you're not gonna not face some kind of pain, but are you gonna really know me and be ready when the
Mhm.
time comes? 'Cause in your end day,
Yeah.
you know, so.
So can you explain 40 and 41 to me then?
Before we go on to that, can you tell me, was 29 through 31, that's relating to the future from here, now?
Well, the Son of Man is always,
Or-
when he says the coming of the Son of Man, which is what that's talking about, that is judgment language, meaning judgment's coming. So that, in a lot of ways, some Christians say that can actually apply both ways. It can apply to them and it can apply to us.
Oh,
Mostly, since he was talking to them, it's mostly gonna apply to them because that's the context, because it's judgment language. It's a prophetic judgment language. So, you know, the sun's gonna be darkened, the moon's gonna turn red, or, you know, not show its light, all of those things. And what happened not too long after this was, everything was destroyed. Everything was destroyed. So, the Romans came through, they destroyed Jerusalem, killed 1.1 million Jews, and only very little of the Christians who fled to the mountains like Jesus told them to. There's the one that were saved.
They couldn't see the sun.
Well, he said, be alarmed, but you won't be alarmed.
Yeah.
The ones that know him won't be alarmed, because, you know, I mean, they really have him, and that's their safe haven. And the other people, there's so many people that think the world's gonna get better with the right politicians and the right army and the right
Yeah.
economy and all that stuff. It ain't gonna happen, you know, not without God in it, you
Yeah.
know, so can't live in fear for all the crazy stuff that's happening in the world.
Remind me, Nick, for some, and I might be out sorts here. Didn't Titus, did he sacrifice a pig on the altar?
I think they did
That
they
sounds-
sacrificed,
I
yeah.
can't.
They said they did do some unholy sacrifices.
Yeah, just for that reason, to,
Right.
you know, dislike God and people, but I can't, I'm trying to think where I read it, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it was in Josephus' stuff.
And that might be,
I read his stuff too, and
yeah.
So yeah, if you read the description of what happened to Jerusalem and all those people, just horrific, some of the most horrific stuff happened to them during that time. Women and kids were killed, you know, and they just slaughtered everybody. So I would encourage you guys, you know, at some point to read the account of that and just kind of, as you're reading Matthew 24, and look over that and see how well that fits to what happened. So. So yeah, that's pretty much all I was going to cover. I just wanted to kind of give you guys some examples as far as how to keep things in context of what's being said. Context is a huge issue, and like I said, even our own members of the church sometimes pull things out of context. A lot of evangelicals that I've talked to, they like to pull stuff out of context, and a lot of it is because there's this focus of our end times. There's this huge focus on that. And so they like to pull verses wherever they can find them and say, oh, this applies to right now, when it actually applied back then. So just be aware of context when you're studying, especially eschatology and anything that has to do with the end times.
In other words, Read your Bible.
Right. Oh, yeah, and one of the things I wanted to bring up too real quick was, if you really want to study the Bible in its context, I would suggest what's called a reader's Bible. And a reader's Bible does not have the chapters and verses. So you can read everything through it without assuming there's some kind of a break in the context. Because just because a chapter ends and a new chapter begins, that's not necessarily always the break in a context. So like, for example, one of the examples I gave is like John chapter 3, when Nicodemus is talking to Jesus, and he says, we know you've been sent from God because of the miracles you've been doing and the signs you've been doing. Well, that if you start in chapter 3, that conversation almost seems like it's out of the blue. But if you look at the end of chapter 2, Jesus was performing miracles in Jerusalem, and everybody was witnessing them. So then that conversation makes sense in that context. But if you think that the context changes between chapters, then it's going to be really confusing.
Well, sometimes in different versions of the Bible too,
Yeah.
people always interpretation insert their own thing. So you'll have even like mine. I think John MacArthur, does great. There's some things I don't necessarily agree with on his stance. So he'll have, I don't disagree with this, but I'll have little headings like Jesus delivered to be crucified. Well, that's great and that's awesome. But sometimes that's just one person's interpretation. And so, again, so much of all of this comes down to just getting God's word, getting God's word. Just let the Holy Spirit just work through us.
And it's all the different Bibles, the words are even changed.
Sure.
In all of the New King James, the King James, the New Living, all the different Bibles, they put it into a context that our age, if you will,
Sure.
can understand. So
Sure.
they change words, and it changes the meaning, I think.
Well, and sometimes we even
And so-
find,
That's why we talked about going
Yeah.
back to the Greek.
Yeah, and you have to really understand what was going on, what that saying, that phrase meant at the time that it was written.
absolutely, absolutely, like the ESV, comes basically out of the, and that's the only reason I like it,
Yeah,
is
me too.
it's just for that reason.
Right.
But the English language is different from the biblical Greek. The English language or the Greek, quote unquote, that's taught is different from the Koine, which was the street Greek. I mean, that was
Right,
just
exactly.
which is what most of the New Testament was
Yeah.
wrote in. So we lose a little bit of stuff in translation, but I believe this. I believe that we have a bigger God, and He can take our and don't misquote me here. I'm not saying mistakes.
Right.
But He can take our misinterpretations and form them the way that He wants them.
Right.
Exactly.
Because you're right. We're spanning all of time. We're spanning different languages, different cultures. And anytime you put a person in the middle of something like that, man, something's gonna get screwed up.
Yep.
It's gonna be changed.
Yeah, I think just again, whatever gets you in God's Word and reading, and just digging in, just digging in bit by bit, piece by piece, line upon line.
Yep.
So
So yeah, just keep in mind context. Yeah, keep in mind context. Keep in mind that just because a chapter changes doesn't mean that the context always changes. So, yeah.
All right. That's right. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah.